Mama, can I ask you something? About our family's past? Who is that woman in the portrait? Who is that woman in the picture?
That was my daughter.
Who lived here before?
How could you do that to me? After everything, I trusted you.
Three months into my marriage, I woke up one morning to find a dead woman's face staring down at me from the exact spot where I had taken it down the night before, and my mother-in-law standing in the doorway with an expression that told me this was a war I had not fully understood I was fighting. If you have ever tried to build a home inside a room that already belonged to someone else's memory, you already know how quietly a marriage can start to feel like trespassing. Stay with me till the end, because the reason behind that portrait was not the reason any of us believed. And if this is your first time here, subscribe now, because grief in this family had been hiding a truth for almost 6 years. My name is Zainab. I married Ibrahim 2 years ago, in a modest ceremony in Kaduna, attended mostly by his family, since mine had traveled up from Sokoto with only a handful of relatives able to make the journey. I was 29 when we married, older than most of my cousins had been at their own weddings, and I had made peace by then with the idea that I might never marry at all, since a woman past 25 in my community starts to feel the weight of certain looks at family gatherings, certain questions asked with a gentleness that does not fully disguise the judgment underneath. When Ibrahim's family came to my father's house with a proposal, I said yes with a full heart, not out of desperation, but because Ibrahim himself, in the 2 months we were permitted to speak before the engagement, had struck me as a genuinely gentle man, careful with his words, careful with silence, the kind of man who listens twice before he answers once. I remember our first proper conversation, a supervised visit at my father's house, with my younger sister sitting close enough to chaperone, but far enough to give us the illusion of privacy. Ibrahim asked me, of all the questions a suitor might open with, what I had wanted to become as a child, before life narrowed my choices the way it narrows most of ours. I told him I had wanted to be a teacher, that I still taught primary school part-time in Sokoto, and instead of a polite, distracted nod most men gave that answer, he asked me 3 more questions about it. What subject, what age group, whether I found it exhausting or restoring. I remember thinking, driving home that evening with my sister teasing me the whole way, that I had never once been asked so many real questions by a man in a single sitting, and that the asking itself felt like a kind of gift I hadn't known to expect. Our engagement lasted 4 months, conducted mostly through phone calls and the occasional supervised visit. And in all that time, Ibrahim mentioned his first marriage only twice, both times briefly, both times with a gentleness that made me trust rather than fear the subject. What I did not fully understand in those 2 months of careful courtship was that Ibrahim was not simply a bachelor waiting to be married. He was a widower. His first wife, Amina, had died 6 years earlier at the age of 26 from complications the family described only as a sudden illness, a phrase repeated so consistently by everyone I asked that I eventually stopped asking, assuming there was simply nothing more anyone wanted to share, and that grief in this family preferred vagueness to detail. They had been married 4 years and had no children, a fact that I would later learn carried its own quiet weight in a household where children were considered the truest proof of a marriage's blessing. When I mentioned Amina to my own mother back in Sokoto, expecting perhaps some hesitation about marrying a widower, I was surprised by her saying that a man who loved well once was often a man who understood, better than most, how to love well again, that grief, properly carried, teaches a person tenderness rather than coldness. I held on to that thought during the months I spent quietly wondering what kind of shadow I might be stepping into. I told myself I was prepared for a husband who still carried some private grief. I was not prepared, I would soon learn, for a house that never actually let that grief become private at all. I tell you all of this not to make you pity me, because I did not enter this marriage blind. Ibrahim told me about Amina himself, gently, honestly, during our third meeting, his voice catching in a way that told me the grief was still real, even 6 years on, but also told me, or so I believed at the time, that it was a grief he had made peace with enough to build a new life around. I respected that. I would have found it strange, honestly, if a man who loved deeply once could not still carry some of that love folded quietly into the man he had become. I did not marry Ibrahim expecting to erase a dead woman from his heart. I only expected, reasonably I thought, to be given room to exist as his living wife inside our own home. That room, it turned out, was smaller than I ever imagined. If you love stories where grief hides a secret nobody in the family has been brave enough to name out loud, this is exactly that story. And I promise you the truth waiting at the bottom of it will surprise you the way it surprised me. Because for a long time, I believed the person standing in my way was simply a grieving mother-in-law who loved her son's first wife too much to let her go. I was wrong about what that love was actually protecting. We moved into a house Ibrahim had built himself, a modest but comfortable 2-story home on the outskirts of Kaduna, purchased with money he had saved over years, working as a civil engineer for a construction firm that built roads and bridges across 3 northern states. It was the same house he had shared with Amina. I knew this going in, and I told myself, quite reasonably I still believe, that a house is only wood and cement and memory, and that memory could be gently reshaped over time, the way you might repaint a wall without pretending the wall had never existed before your paint touched it. The house itself was lovely, honestly, spacious by the standards of most young couples we knew, with a small garden Ibrahim had planted himself along the side wall, mango and guava trees still young enough to need staking. My mother-in-law had helped him choose curtains and furniture years earlier, and much of that furniture I noticed on my first walk through the house as its new mistress remained exactly as it had been arranged for Amina. The same sitting room layout, the same kitchen organization, down to which cupboard held the good plates reserved for guests. I did not think much of it at first. Grief moves slowly in a household, I told myself, and a man recently remarried, still adjusting to the presence of a second wife in rooms that had only ever known his first, could hardly be expected to have rearranged an entire life in the 2 months between our wedding and my arrival. What I did not expect was to walk into our bedroom on my very first night as a married woman and find hanging directly above our headboard a large framed photograph of Amina, a formal photograph taken, I would later learn, on her own wedding day, her face soft and luminous in the particular way brides look in photographs, taken before life had the chance to complicate anything yet. I said nothing that first night. I told myself it was an oversight, that Ibrahim, in the flurry of preparing the house for a new wife, had simply forgotten to take it down, the way a man absorbed in 100 small logistics might overlook one large obvious thing sitting directly above his own bed. I asked him about it gently over breakfast the next morning, careful not to sound accusatory, only curious. He looked, I remember, genuinely startled, as though he too had somehow stopped seeing the portrait the way you stop seeing a piece of furniture that has sat in the same corner for years. He apologized immediately and promised to take it down that same evening. He did take it down. I watched him do it myself, watched him wrap it carefully in an old wrapper and carry it to a storage room at the back of the house, and I felt for the first time since my wedding that our bedroom had genuinely become ours. 3 days later, it was back on the wall. I assumed at first that Ibrahim had simply changed his mind, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps out of a grief that had resurfaced more strongly than he expected once the portrait was actually out of sight. I asked him about it, and his answer confused me more than it reassured me. He said he hadn't put it back. He said he had no idea how it had returned to the wall at all. It was his younger sister, Halima, who eventually told me the truth, in the careful, sideways manner families use when they want you to know something without technically being the one who told you. Their mother, Hajia Fatima, had a key to the house, a fact I had previously not known since Ibrahim had never mentioned it and I had never thought to ask, and had let herself in during the 2 days we were both at work, retrieved the portrait from the storage room, cleaned the glass, and rehung it in exactly the spot it had occupied for 6 years before I had ever set foot in that bedroom. If your chest is already tightening the way mine did hearing that, stay with me, because this is only the beginning of a conflict that would eventually pull apart threads none of us knew were still holding this family together. Subscribe now if you haven't, because what I discovered underneath my mother-in-law's insistence was not simple grief at all. I confronted Hajia Fatima directly, as gently as I could manage, the following weekend, during a visit to her house for Sunday lunch that had until that point been a warm, easy tradition between us. I chose my words carefully in the car on the way over, rehearsing them under my breath the way you rehearse something you know might not land the way you intended to. Over the meal, jollof rice and grilled fish, her specialty, made with the kind of generous portions that had always made me feel welcomed into this family, I waited until the plates were cleared and the tea had been poured before raising the subject, my heart beating harder than I expected for a conversation I had told myself would be simple and reasonable. I told her I understood her love for Amina, that I would never ask the family to forget a woman who clearly meant so much to all of them, but that our bedroom, my bedroom now, as much as it had once been Amina's, needed to feel like a space I was permitted to actually live in. Hajia Fatima's response has stayed with me word for word in the months since. She set her teacup down very deliberately, the way a person does when they are buying themselves a moment to choose their next words carefully, and said, "That portrait has hung in that room since the day Amina became this family's daughter. She was the woman who gave this family its first happiness after years of waiting for Ibrahim to marry. You do not erase the woman who built the foundation simply because you are the one now living in the house." I tried to explain, as carefully as I could, that I was not trying to erase anyone, only to be permitted my own space inside a marriage that was supposed to belong to me too. I told her I respected Amina's memory, that I understood I had married into a family with a history I had not lived through myself, but that a bedroom shared with a portrait of my husband's first wife, hung directly above the bed we slept in, was not a small or unreasonable thing for a new wife to struggle with. She grew quiet then, in a way that felt less like agreement and more like a door closing. "You young women today," she said finally, "you want everything to disappear so quickly. You do not understand what it costs an old woman to watch a memory get folded away into a storage room like unwanted furniture." I left that lunch with a headache that lasted the rest of the day, and a growing sense that this conflict was, in fact, not primarily about me at all. Hajia Fatima's grief had a texture to it that felt larger and more specific than ordinary mourning, something with edges I couldn't yet see the shape of. And the more I sat with her words, "what it costs an old woman," the more I suspected there was a cost buried in that sentence that had nothing to do with love in its simplest form. Over the following weeks, I began paying closer attention, the way you do when a nagging feeling refuses to leave you alone. I noticed that Hajia Fatima visited Amina's grave every single Friday, without fail, rain or shine, a devotion that struck even Halima's Ibrahim's sister as usual, since their own father, Hajia Fatima's late husband, received visits only on his death anniversary each year. I noticed, too, the particular way Hajia Fatima spoke about Amina at family gatherings, never casually, never in the ordinary, occasionally teasing way families usually remember their dead, but always with a kind of careful reverence, as though even in memory, Amina required a formality the rest of us were spared. Aunts and cousins would sometimes share a funny memory of some other relative long past, laughing easily, but any mention of Amina brought a hush to the room, a solemnity that felt, the longer I sat with it, less like grief and more like guardedness. I noticed that Hajia Fatima kept, in a locked wooden box in her own bedroom, a collection of Amina's belongings, not shared family keepsakes, but deeply personal items, letters, a diary, pieces of jewelry Amina had worn as a young bride, items that by rights logically should have passed to Ibrahim as her husband, or perhaps to Amina's own birth family, rather than remaining locked in her mother-in-law's private possession for 6 years. When I mentioned this once to Ibrahim, carefully, he shrugged and said he had simply never thought to ask his mother for them, that grief made a person avoid certain conversations rather than pursue them, a sentiment I understood even as it left me with more questions than it answered. I asked Halima carefully one afternoon when we were alone folding laundry together, whether their mother had always been this close to Amina, whether the two of them had simply had an unusually warm relationship as mother-in-law and daughter-in-law. Halima's face did something complicated when I asked that question, a flicker of hesitation before she answered, carefully. They were close eventually. It wasn't always easy between them, especially at the beginning, but after Amina died, Mama changed. She became different, softer about Amina than she ever was while Amina was actually alive. That sentence sat with me for days. Softer about Amina than she ever was while Amina was actually alive. It was the first crack in the story I had been told, the first suggestion that the shrine my mother-in-law had built around a dead woman's memory might be constructed, at least in part, out of something other than pure, uncomplicated love. If you're still with me, subscribe, because the truth I eventually uncovered explained not just the portrait, but 6 years of grief so heavy it had reshaped an entire family's relationship to a locked bedroom wall. I did something I am not entirely proud of, though I have made peace with it in the months since. During a visit to Hajia Fatima's house when she had stepped out briefly to the market, I asked Halima, who by then had become something close to an ally in my confusion, whether she still had access to the wooden box their mother kept. Halima hesitated for a long moment before retrieving a spare key from the kitchen, telling me quietly that she too had wondered for years what exactly their mother was protecting so fiercely, and that perhaps it was time someone finally looked. We worked quickly, both of us aware that Hajia Fatima's market trips rarely lasted longer than an hour. Both of us nervous in the particular way you feel when you are about to learn something you cannot later unlearn. The box smelled faintly of old cloth and the dried lavender sachets Hajia Fatima kept among her linens. Beneath layers of jewelry and old photographs, I found Amina's diary, a slim cloth-bound notebook filled with her handwriting, entries spanning the 4 years of her marriage to Ibrahim, the pages soft at the edges from years of being reread, I suspected, by hands other than the ones that had originally written them. I want to be honest with you about how conflicted I felt reading a dead woman's private words, holding in my hands sentences she likely never intended anyone but herself to see. But I also believed by that point that something in that diary held the key to understanding a conflict that had already begun to quietly poison my own marriage. Haliman read alongside me, sitting close enough that our shoulders touched, and more than once I watched her hand come up to cover her mouth as we turned the pages together, watched tears gather in her eyes for a sister-in-law she clearly loved, and I began to realize had perhaps also quietly failed, the way an entire family sometimes fails one member without any single person meaning to.
The early entries were ordinary. A young bride's hopes, small complaints about in-law customs she found difficult to adjust to, tender observations about a husband she was slowly learning to love. She wrote about learning to cook the specific way Ibrahim liked his tuwo, about a garden she hoped to plant once they had settled properly, about small jokes shared between them that made the strangeness of a new marriage feel bearable. Reading those early pages, I recognized pieces of my own first months of marriage so clearly that it became difficult at moments to keep reminding myself that the woman writing them was gone. But roughly a year into the marriage, the entries shifted in tone. Amina wrote in increasingly guarded language about a mother-in-law who found fault with nearly everything she did, the way she cooked, the way she dressed, the way she had not yet, after a full year of marriage, given the family a child. She described evenings where Hajia Hachima would comment in front of guests about how quickly some women settle into a household while others take their time finding their place. Comments dressed as gentle observation, but landing, Amina wrote, like small, precise cuts that never fully closed before the next one arrived. One entry, dated almost 2 years before Amina's death, read simply, "Mama Ibrahim told me today that a wife who cannot give a house its first happiness will always be a guest in it, no matter how many years she stays." I felt something cold settle in my stomach reading that line, because it was, I realized, almost exactly the same phrase Hajia Fatima had used to me at that Sunday lunch about the portrait. She was the woman who gave this family its first happiness. Except now, I understood that sentence had originally been a weapon, not a tribute, first pointed at Amina during her own struggle to conceive, only later repurposed after her death into a shrine. The diary grew heavier from there. Amina wrote about a difficult, isolating final year of marriage, a mother-in-law who had grown convinced through some combination of tradition and superstition I could not fully untangle even reading it directly, that Amina's failure to conceive was a spiritual failing rather than a medical one, and who had begun, according to Amina's own increasingly exhausted entries, subjecting her to a series of traditional consultations and remedies that Amina found frightening and dehumanizing, but felt she had no power to refuse as a young bride still trying to earn her place in a household that had never fully welcomed her. She described one such consultation in careful, restrained language that nonetheless carried a rawness that made both Halima and me go quiet for a long moment before turning the page. A night involving herbs, a locked room, and instructions Amina described only as things I will not write here, because writing them makes them realer than I can bear. The final entries, written in the last months of Amina's life, described a persistent illness. Fatigue, pain, symptoms Amina herself seemed to suspect were more serious than the family was treating them as. She wrote about being tired constantly, about a pain in her side that came and went with a rhythm she couldn't predict, about nights she lay awake convinced something inside her was genuinely wrong, only to be told each morning that rest and patience were the proper remedies. One entry, dated barely 6 weeks before she died, was shorter than the others, almost fragmentary, as though written by a hand too exhausted to complete its own thoughts. Ibrahim is traveling again. I did not tell him how bad it has become. I do not want him to worry about the bridge project on my account. I will ask again when he returns. He never got the chance to hear her ask again. If your heart is aching the way mine was reading that, I understand, and I ask you to stay with me, because the truth underneath Hajia Fatima's devotion to that portrait was heavier than anything I had imagined. Amina died 5 weeks after that entry, from what the family even now describes only as sudden complications, but what I now believe, based on everything I read and everything Halima quietly confirmed to me afterwards with tears in her eyes, was an illness that had gone undiagnosed and untreated for months, dismissed repeatedly by a mother-in-law convinced the problem was spiritual rather than medical, until it progressed far enough that by the time Amina was finally taken to a proper hospital, it was too late to save her. Halima told me, her voice barely above a whisper, that she remembered the night it finally happened, their mother's panic, unlike anything she had ever witnessed before, the frantic search for a vehicle at nearly midnight, the drive to the hospital that felt, even to a teenage girl at the time, unbearably long. She remembered the doctor's face when he came out to speak to the family, the particular gentleness doctors use when the news is the kind that cannot be softened by any arrangement of words. Hajia Fatima had spent 6 years, I came to understand, not simply mourning a beloved daughter-in-law, but quietly, privately, carrying the unbearable weight of having contributed, through her own stubbornness and superstition, to that daughter-in-law's death. The portrait on the bedroom wall was not a tribute born of uncomplicated love. It was penance, an old woman's desperate, ongoing attempt to atone for a guilt she had never once spoken aloud to another living soul,
built out of a devotion so fierce, precisely because the love underneath it had arrived too late to save the woman it was now protecting so ferociously. I understood sitting there with Halima in the fading afternoon light why Hajia Fatima visited that grave every single Friday without fail, why she had kept Amina's most private belongings locked away rather than handed to Ibrahim or Amina's own family, why the thought of that portrait being folded into a storage room struck her as something closer to a second death than a simple redecoration. She was not protecting a memory. She was protecting herself from having to fully face what that memory actually contained. I confronted Ibrahim with the diary that same evening, unable to carry the weight of what I now knew alone any longer. I remember how my hands shook handing it to him, how I sat beside him on the edge of our bed, the very bed that had sat beneath Amina's portrait for so many months, and watched my husband read his first wife's private words for the first time in 6 years. I watched his face move through disbelief, then grief, then a kind of quiet, devastated anger I had never seen in him before. His jaw tightening, his eyes moving faster and faster across the pages, as though trying to outrun the meaning of what he was reading, occasionally stopping altogether, his whole body going still over a single sentence before he could make himself continue. He had not known, he told me in a voice that broke in a way that frightened me a little, how bad it had truly been in that final year. He had been traveling frequently for work, overseeing a bridge project in a neighboring state, home only every few weeks, and had trusted his mother without question to care for his wife properly in his absence. He kept returning as he spoke to the entry about the herbalist, reading it aloud twice, as though needing to hear it in his own voice before he could fully accept it as true. He had believed all these years the story everyone told him, sudden illness, nothing anyone could have prevented, because believing anything else would have meant that his own mother's stubbornness had cost him the woman he loved, and that his own frequent absence had left Amina without an advocate when she needed one most. I should have been here, he said over and over in a voice that barely recognized, until I finally took the diary gently from his hands and held him while he wept in a way that I don't think he had allowed himself since the week Amina died. We drove to Hajia Fatima's house together that same night, the diary in Ibrahim's hands, both of us silent for most of the drive, the kind of silence that isn't empty but heavy with everything we neither of us yet knew how to say aloud. She opened the door already sensing, I think, from the look on Ibrahim's face that something had shifted permanently between them, and led us into her sitting room with the careful, formal politeness of a woman bracing herself for something she had perhaps always known on some buried level would arrive at her door.
What followed was the most painful conversation I have ever witnessed between a mother and her son. Ibrahim read passages aloud, his voice shaking, sometimes barely audible, sometimes cracking entirely, and Hajia Fatima sat across from him in her favorite chair, her hands folded in her lap, her spine straight in the manner of a woman determined not to fall apart in front of her own child, even as everything in her posture suggested she was fighting exactly that. I will not recount every word of it here, because some grief is not mine to share in full, but I will tell you that Hajia Fatima did not deny a single thing Ibrahim read aloud to her. She did not once interrupt him, did not once offer an excuse or a justification, simply absorbed each sentence the way you absorb a blow you have been bracing yourself against for years, one that somehow still manages to hurt exactly as much as you always feared it would. When he finished, the room fell into a silence so complete I could hear the ceiling fan ticking overhead, and Hajia Fatima simply said, in a voice smaller than I had ever heard from a woman who had always struck me as formidable, I have prayed every single day for 6 years that Allah would forgive me for what my foolishness cost this family. I did not know how to say it to you, Ibrahim, because saying it meant admitting I killed the daughter I finally learned too late to truly love. She looked up at him then, her eyes wet in a way I had genuinely never seen before, and added, so quietly I almost missed it, I told myself the portrait was for her memory. Perhaps it was only ever for my own forgiveness, which I have never once believed I deserved to receive. If you've been with me this whole story, subscribe now,
Because what happened in the months after that confrontation was not a clean healing, and I think that honesty matters more than a tidy ending would. Nothing about our family resolved itself neatly after that night. Hajia Fatima did not transform overnight into a different woman, and Ibrahim did not simply forgive her mother the way people do in stories built for easy comfort. There were weeks afterward where he barely spoke to her at all. Weeks where I watched a man I loved carry a grief so complicated for a wife he'd lost, for a mother he could no longer see the same way, for his own absence during the year that mattered most, that I sometimes did not know how to reach him across the distance of it all. He threw himself into work during that period, taking on a new project that kept him away even more than usual, and I understood, without needing him to explain it to me, that the distance was not about me, but about a man trying to outrun a grief that had suddenly grown a second, sharper edge he hadn't been prepared to carry. I found myself during those difficult weeks playing a strange kind of mediator between mother and son, a role I never expected to occupy in a marriage barely a year old. I visited Hajia Fatima alone twice during that period, partly out of a genuine complicated compassion that had grown in me despite everything, and partly because I could see how thoroughly her own grief and guilt had begun to hollow her out once it was finally spoken aloud, rather than buried beneath ritual and devotion. She had lost weight. She barely left her room some days, according to Halima, who had taken to checking on her more frequently than usual. I did not tell her during those visits that everything was forgiven, because it was not my forgiveness to offer. I simply sat with her, the way she had once, I imagine, wanted someone to sit with Amina during that final difficult year, and let her talk, haltingly, about a guilt that had clearly been waiting 6 years for permission to finally take up space out loud. We did move the portrait eventually, but not into a storage room, and not in the manner I had originally angrily imagined doing it in the earliest weeks of our conflict. Ibrahim built a small memorial corner in the sitting room instead, a quiet shelf with Amina's portrait, a few of her books, a framed page from her diary that he chose himself, a passage about her hopes for the family she had once dreamed of raising in that house. He walked on that corner over a weekend, sanding and staining the small shelf himself, rather than buying one ready-made. And I understood, watching him, that the labor itself was part of how he needed to grieve, with his hands, the way he had always processed the harder things in his life, whether a difficult bridge design or a difficult truth about his own family. It was not erasure, it was placement. Amina giving a home inside our house that honored what she had actually been, a beloved woman who deserved better than either the harsh mother-in-law of her final year or the untouchable saint of the 6 years after her death. And I found, once it was done, that I no longer resented her presence in our home at all. How could I resent a woman whose own diary had made her, for me, achingly, undeniably human? I visit that corner now, sometimes on quiet afternoons, and I find myself talking to her a little, the way you might talk to an older sister you never got the chance to meet, thanking her strangely for a diary I never should have had to read that nonetheless gave both of us in the end something neither of us had before. Me, an understanding of the ground I was standing on, and her, finally, a voice loud enough to be heard by the family that had once made her feel so quiet and so small. Hajia Fatima visits that corner now, still every Friday, though the visits have changed in a way I find hard to fully describe. More like devotion at an altar, but more like a woman quietly sitting with an old friend she failed once and has spent years trying, imperfectly, to make peace with. She and I are not close in the easy way I once hoped we might become. Something in me still remembers, and probably always will, the particular ache of those first months, feeling like a guest in my own bedroom, though I no longer believe she meant that cruelty towards me specifically. I believe now that I simply arrived inside a wound so old and so unspoken that any second wife would have found herself standing unknowingly on the same unhealed ground. Ibrahim and I are still building our marriage slowly in the space that remains once you've made room for a grief this large. We have our own room now, truly, our own, without a dead woman's eyes following us through every morning and evening. And some nights, lying beside him in that quiet, unshadowed bedroom, I think about Amina's diary entry. A wife who cannot give a house its first happiness will always be a guest in it. And I make a small, private promise to myself that I will never let that particular cruelty live inside our home again, towards myself or towards anyone who comes after me. Ibrahim has changed too, in ways I notice mostly in small gestures rather than grand declarations. He calls his mother more often now, but he also asks her harder questions than he used to, gently pushing back when she slips into the old patterns of speech that once wounded Amina, and in smaller ways occasionally still wound me. He has become, I think, a man more willing to look directly at difficult things rather than trusting that distance and time will quietly resolve them on their own. I do not know if he has fully forgiven his mother. I am not certain forgiveness in a wound this deep ever arises as a single completed thing rather than a practice you return to imperfectly again and again. We are expecting our first child now, a fact that fills me with a joy I sometimes have to remind myself not to feel guilty about, given everything Amina once suffered for wanting the very thing I have been given so easily. I think of her sometimes when I feel the baby move, and instead of grief, what I mostly feel now is a strange, tender gratitude for a woman whose unfinished story, once I was finally brave enough to read it all the way to the end, taught an entire family how to grieve honestly instead of silently, and taught me, a stranger who never met her, exactly what kind of wife and mother I hope to become for whoever comes to live in these rooms after me. If there is anything I have learned from all of this, it is that grief unspoken does not stay small. It grows quietly into shapes the people around it are forced to live inside without ever understanding why the walls feel so heavy. A portrait on a wall is never only a portrait. Sometimes it is a woman's unfinished story, still waiting years later for someone brave enough to finally read it all the way to the end. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the quiet, unspoken grief hidden in your own family's walls, subscribe and stay close, because I have more of these true stories to share, about the things families bury under love, and the truths that only surface once someone is finally brave enough to look at it straight on. Until the next one, be gentle with the people carrying griefs you cannot see, and braver when it is your turn to finally say the thing that has stayed silent for far too long.